The Senate rewrote itself today on the rights of the disabled. And the United States Senate shamed itself today, once again. It pains me to say that, it really does. Having worked in the Senate for 7 years, I think the Senate remains a great institution which has done much, much more to be proud of than the rare occurrences that it should be ashamed of. I don't usually think that when a vote doesn't go my way in the United States Senate that the Senate should be ashamed of itself. I think that the Senate has a right, a moral right, to arrive at outcomes that I don't like, to arrive at outcomes that I hate, and to arrive at those outcomes through a reasonable exercise of Senate decision-making. I don't think that every procedural roadblock that Republicans throw in front of Senate Democrats is shameful. I've seen Democrats do the same thing to Republicans, and I, working on the Senate floor, have tried to do the same thing to Republicans myself. In my 7 years in the Senate, I didn't recall one day of shame for the Senate as a whole. Most senators were innocent bystanders in the Judiciary Committee's hearing that pitted Anita Hill against Clarence Thomas. If, from the Anita Hill perspective or the Clarence Thomas perspective, you found that hearing shameful, the shame was on the Judiciary Committee, in my view, and not on the United States Senate acting as a whole. I tell you all this simply to stress how rare it is, how difficult it is for me to proclaim a day of shame in the United States Senate. This was such a day of shame and sadness. John Kerry, in his role as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was leading the Senate as the floor manager of a treaty. On the other side of the aisle, the senior Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee rose not in opposition but in support of that same treaty. Richard Lugar and John Kerry got 61 votes in the Senate today for ratification of a United Nations treaty on the rights of the disabled, which was modeled on a law passed by the Senate 22 years ago. The Americans with Disabilities Act. In effect, it was a vote to export American law to the 155 nations around the world that have signed this treaty, a treaty that has already been ratified by 126 of those countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany, China. Russia has ratified it. Now, you can pass anything in the Senate with 60 votes, except treaties, which require 66, a two-thirds majority. Every Democrat voted for the treaty, and only 8 Republicans voted for the treaty. 38 Republicans disgraced themselves and disgraced the Senate by voting against it and controlling the outcome. John Kerry tried everything he could on the Senate floor to show Republicans the way to vote for this treaty.
It really isn't controversial. What this treaty says is very simple. It just says that you can't discriminate against the disabled. It says that other countries have to do what we did 22 years ago when we set the example for the world and passed the Americans with Disabilities Act.
The treaty was supported by organizations representing people with disabilities and veterans groups, but that wasn't good enough for 38 Republicans. It was supported by Senator John McCain, himself a disabled veteran.
Bob Dole has been our leader on the issue of disabilities from the moment he stepped foot into the chamber. To Bob, it's unthinkable that Americans could not get over a curb or enter a school building or even watch a debate in this chamber if they were in a wheelchair.
But that wasn't good enough for 38 of John McCain's Republican colleagues, including his usual ally, Lindsey Graham. Treaties take years to negotiate before they come to a vote. This treaty, though signed by President Obama, was actually negotiated by President George W. Bush. But that wasn't good enough for 38 Republicans. Republicans made up transparently ridiculous reasons to vote against it. They said it threatened America's sovereignty, even though Senator Kerry repeatedly showed them that the treaty requires no changes in U.S. law and that the treaty cannot be used as the basis for a lawsuit in U.S. courts. The opponents then said it was inappropriate to consider a treaty in a post-election lame duck session. Never mind that just since I've been watching the Senate, they've approved treaties 19 times during lame duck sessions. And then they said, and this is what did it, this is what the 38 no votes were, trapped by the tiniest possible interest group you could imagine affecting the outcome of something so important. the homeschooling crowd. Then they said that the treaty endangered homeschooling. Homeschooling fanatics expressed worry that the treaty could lead to the government imposing new regulations on the homeschooling of disabled children, even though there is no language they could point to in the treaty that could justify any such worry. Republicans who knew this was a lie still based their vote on it because that's how much they live in fear of any interest group of any size with any affiliation with the Tea Party. The opposition to the treaty was led by Tea Party darling Mike Lee of Utah, who is in the second undistinguished year of what America can only hope is a short Senate career. The senior senator from Utah, Orrin Hatch, who voted for the Americans with Disabilities Act 22 years ago, voted against the treaty today because he now, even after just winning re-election, lives in fear of Tea Party protesters at his door of his local office in Utah. Orrin Hatch, who embarrassed himself, some would say shamed himself, in the Anita Hill Clarence Thomas hearings, has many, many times in his 35-year Senate career cast honorable votes. I've seen him do it. Cast honorable votes that were not politically easy for him to cast. But those days are over for Orrin Hatch now. And today proved it in a deeply personal way. As the vote approached, former Senator Bob Dole, a dear friend of Orrin Hatch's, was wheeled onto the Senate floor by his wife, former Senator Elizabeth Dole. Bob Dole, himself a disabled war veteran, was a strong, but on this day silent supporter of the treaty. Rolling the 89-year-old former Republican Senate leader onto the floor was a move designed to reach into the hearts of the senators on that floor who knew Bob Dole well, who worked with him closely in the old days. Senators like Orrin Hatch, Chuck Grassley, Mitch McConnell, Richard Shelby, Thad Cochran. Senator Dole went to the floor today needing just 5 yes votes from old friends. Here's how Bob Dole's old friends voted.
Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran. No. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. No. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, no. Senators voting in the negative. McConnell. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, no.
Bob Dole needed 5 votes today. Those 5 votes were all he needed. Bob Dole reached into their hearts today and found nothing. After the vote, John Kerry said, "It was one of the saddest days I've seen in almost 28 years in the Senate. We know that when Bob Dole leaves us, which I hope doesn't happen for a very, very long time, those 5 men, if they're still with us, will rise on the Senate floor and speak in honor of Bob Dole. They will mean every word of their praise for their former leader and faithful friend. But they will know, and we will know, that on the day when they could have really honored Bob Dole, honored his wisdom, his vision as a legislator, honored his friendship and his personal kindnesses to them over many, many years, they failed Bob Dole with one word: no. They failed their old friend. They dishonored themselves. And they dishonored the United States Senate.